Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Five Drinks or Midnight, the show where we bring the questions, guests bring the drinks, we try to wrap up by midnight. Today we're talking to Colin Spoelman, co-founder and distiller at Kings County Distillery here in Brooklyn. But before we do, like and subscribe, do all the thingies. Really help us out. Thanks. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Five Drinks or Midnight, five drinks, five questions, midnight, whatever comes first. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to drinking some of these. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm relaxed. I'm thirsty. You know, that's all you need.
Excellent. I guess first thing is, which one of these lovely bottles are we cracking open first?
I'm going to recommend we start with our most popular and I suppose most well-known whiskey. That would be our straight bourbon. I have the 750 bottle here.
That is straight bourbon. Excellent. That one right there. Pull a little bit. All right. Well, cheers.
Cheers. So I'll tell you a little bit about it while you sip.
Please.
So this is 80% New York State corn, organic corn grown in the Finger Lakes region. It's 20% English malted barley of a strain called Golden Promise. It's pot distilled. It's aged 3 years minimum, and it's kind of our flagship at this point. We've had a few different whiskeys that have come and gone through the years, but this has always been our most popular. So
cheers. It's amazing. Again, I'm a big fan of Kings County. I mean, I've been in love with you guys' stuff for a while, and I think we'll get into a little bit, but I think it came down to the bottle. I absolutely started my love affair. But jumping into the question one, is a guy that studied architecture and theater at Yale end up in Brooklyn making whiskey?
Right. I think to answer that question, you have to go back to Eastern Kentucky and say, how does a person who grows up in the sort of hills of Appalachia with like a Presbyterian preacher as a father, you know, how did I get from there to Yale first? And then how did I get from that to making whiskey? The whiskey is maybe obvious if you get the fact that I come from Kentucky, but I'm not really from the bourbon part of Kentucky. I'm from ultimately the moonshine part of Kentucky. And so it was really kind of after living in Brooklyn for a while, and people would kind of, you know, people's frame of reference for Kentucky is bourbon. So that's all anybody ever wanted to talk to me about. And I kind of, you know, embraced it after a little while and got sort of, I realized this was my cultural inheritance. This is my gift to the world as a Kentuckian. And, but more than that, I got interested in kind of my specific heritage, which was more the moonshine side of things. And so I would travel back to Kentucky and try and find moonshine from the bootleggers that were around, and then brought that to New York and shared it with people. And kind of then through that cultural exchange, if you will, I got interested in really learning how to distill myself as a hobbyist. There, you know, isn't really, I mean, there are hobby distillers. It's illegal, so you have to walk that line.
Yep.
But it was, you know, the internet made the anonymity and sort of exchange of information a little easier. And so I got to distilling in my apartment, and really with a thought of running this clandestine Brooklyn moonshine operation. And, you know, there were advantages and disadvantages to that strategy, and very quickly realized that what I was really interested in probably was more lasting than just, you know, being sort of a bootlegger. And looked into what it would, you know, out of curiosity, looked into getting a license, and realized that getting a license had just become easier in New York State, and that you know, it would be sort of an adventure to kind of take this, you know, sort of apartment-sized project and try and build it into a business. So, so in 2009, applied to become a distillery, and then realized in 2010 that we were actually the first fully licensed distillery, focused, you know, craft distillery, whiskey distillery, and since Prohibition. And so started off by making, as many distilleries start with gin and vodka, we just started with Moonshine, which is unaged whiskey. And so, you know, the whether or not theater or architecture plays into it from my collegiate major, you know, maybe somehow a little bit. I think being a sort of aesthetic person and being a storyteller certainly are both aspects of the job that I consider to be very important. But I would say more than anything else, it's just my sort of deeper history growing up in Kentucky that probably got me hooked on distilling, and in particular the illicit side of the distilling, the sort of moonshine kind of anti-establishment kind of thing that got me interested. If I'd stayed in Kentucky, I don't think I would have become a distiller, but being in New York and kind of recognizing the opportunity and just the culture, that's how I got started, for sure.
That's awesome. I have two follow-up questions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
One, is it true that like you were shooting a film down in Kentucky and you got the whole crew tanked off of moonshine?
Yes. Yeah. So it's kind of a crazy story that I don't get to tell much, but one of my other great interests in life, in addition to whiskey, is movies, and I had this scheme to make a movie. This was kind of in the era of like Blair Witch Project, and there were a lot of like digital sort of low budget movies. And so I had this idea to go, if you know Kentucky, there's a lot of caves in Kentucky. So I had this idea to shoot this whole movie about people being trapped in a cave. And so brought a group of New York actors and a little crew down to Kentucky. And we went into a cave pretty much for 2 weeks straight. We would go in and shoot these scenes, and it was kind of a cool project. Never went anywhere, but as a part of the wrap party, I was able to get some moonshine, and it was really the first time since high school that I had been in Kentucky and sort of around the bootleggers, and kind of got the idea to kind of bring that. You know, I had a gallon of it. What do you do with a gallon of moonshine at like 150 proof? So that was originally what I brought back to my apartment and started sharing with people, and that's what got me really most sort of intrigued with the further potential of moonshine. You know, in the beginning, it was just sort of a fun way to, again, this sort of cultural exchange of New York and Kentucky. And it was really both that experience of giving people moonshine while I was in Kentucky, but then bringing that back to New York and kind of sharing it with people.
And then too, I know you moved here to be an architect. Do you miss being an architect?
Well, I should say that my undergraduate education, I didn't get the type of degree that one would have to be an architect. I was more sort of on the like criticism, theory, history, culture of architecture. And the job that I had before doing this was I worked for he was the former dean of Columbia's architecture school, and doing a little bit of like storytelling. I mean, storytelling is sort of a theme around buildings. You know, when he would design a project, or the office would design a project, there was always the matter of like, how do you explain it to the client, or to, usually the client is a government or the general public or something like that. So I do miss this sort of world of architecture, but I was not well set up to sort of go very far in that world. And so there was always this feeling of, well, if I want to be an architect, I have to go back to school for 3 years. And if I want to be a distiller, I can do it tonight, you know? And so I guess ultimately that is what won out, because it was immediate. And also, like, architecture is a very, it like whiskey, it is a thing that takes many, many years to earn your sort of reputation. And so in a way, I like those things that do the sort of life commitment sort of disciplines. But ultimately, you know, when I would meet people, what excited people in conversation was not architecture. Often it was more the still I had going on in the backyard. So so I don't know. I stuck with it. My roommate at the time and business partner is David Haskell. He's now editor in chief at New York Magazine. He had always been. He'd sort of started a magazine and was very entrepreneurial, and I had sort of done that movie project, which was in a way entrepreneurial. So we both had a little bit of experience trying to, like, put something together with very few resources. And so he and I together raised $30,000 to go get the license hire a liquor attorney, to get the distillation equipment, very small hobby scale stuff, really the same stuff that I was using in the apartment, but just enough to kind of satisfy the legal requirements to become a distillery. Always knowing that it might not really work out, because at the time, I mean, it's very understood now what a craft distillery is, but, you know, the whole joke of the late 2000s was, you know, there's all these companies in Brooklyn that are making pickles and coffee. Are they crazy? Can you imagine thinking of starting a coffee company? You have to have equipment, and, you know, just we now it's a little bit more understood how somebody might do that sort of thing, but it was a different sort of relationship to that kind of thing back then. So it was entirely possible that people were going to reject the idea. And so we started very small and very cautiously, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, that's question one. So we got our origin story now, but are you still sipping? You ready for question two? Or
I mean, let's move on. I can, you know, the peated bourbon is the next whiskey.
Okay. Got that. Okay.
And so the way this product came about is we were making a single malt, and there was a lot of sort of interest around American single malts. There was a New York Times article, and I thought, well, we can make a single malt, and I think we could do it better than those that were getting press at the time. And so we had some unpeated malted barley, the kind that we use for our regular bourbon, the Golden Promise that we're still using. And then we also had some peated Scottish barley that we were using for the single malt. And then one day we ran out of the malt that we use for the regular bourbon. And the distiller on duty, Rob Easter, was like, I'm going to make bourbon with a peated malt, because either it's that or I go home and we don't get our day in. So I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And we tried it. We probably opened a barrel after a year, and it was delicious, number one, and it was a thing that made sense for us to do, because we're not a Kentucky distillery. We're not a Scotch distillery either, but we, you know, New York is this melting pot of all these different cultures, so we could borrow from Kentucky and borrow from Scotland and borrow these different techniques and put it together and make it a whiskey that nobody's ever had before. And so that is the story behind the peated bourbon.
Cheers to that.
Cheers.
And then,
so yeah, this one is 75% corn, 25% of the Scottish peated malt. So it just gives you a little bit of a, like, smoky finish to it. Not super peaty. You wouldn't
You don't get any of it on the nose, but you do get it on the finish.
Yeah, it's a cool whiskey. This is our second most popular whiskey, and certainly more of a whiskey insiders kind of thing. You kind of have to know peat a little bit and why people would drink something that has peat in it and be a little curious about it. A lot of people don't think that they like peat, and I maybe am one of them, but but in a small quantity, it just adds a great degree of complexity to what is otherwise a younger whiskey. This is a 2-year whiskey, so what makes it taste above its age profile is certainly that peat.
All right, well, that brings us to question 2 then. Living in Brooklyn and starting out as a moonshiner, you have the great combination of probably having one of the best nicknames as a Brooklyn moonshiner. What would your Brooklyn moonshiner nickname be?
Well, I will say when I was growing up, people called me Trigger, which was, I don't exactly know what that was a reference to. I was really short when I was in high school, so I was not big enough to be the whole gun, according to Shaq.
Trigger works. I mean, but I think that fit again. It might have a different meaning in Kentucky than it might here in Brooklyn, but I think that it still works. It's just Brooklyn always has those weird there's Tony Bag of Donuts from down the street, and then moonshiners you always hear the funny nicknames that they have. So you have the great ability to have both of them. So.
Right. I mean, I definitely feel like I understand my Kentucky nickname better than I understand what my Brooklyn nickname would be. I'm Navy Yard. I don't know. It's got to be alliterative. I don't know. It's tough. Yeah.
I really enjoy this. This is really nice. And were you guys the first to do the peated bourbon then?
So far as I know, I mean,
always remember, if you ain't first, you're last.
I think other people had laid down peated bourbon more or less around the time that we started doing it. We were the first to bring it to market, as far as I can tell. And there's others who have done, sort of finishing bourbon in a peated Scotch cask, and there are some other peated bourbons now on the market. But I think, there was a little bit of an obsession in the craft world with smoke, and Balcones has a lot of those like sort of smoky whiskeys. And peat for me was a way to kind of play with smoke, but not necessarily have something that was so heavy-handed in the way that some of those whiskeys were. So.
Gotcha. And I mean, you guys experiment a lot with, like you had your Applejack that you guys did, you have your oatmeal bourbon as well. Mm-hmm. Is there any like grain or experiment that you'd want to play with in the future? Not like a scoop or anything, but just like,
no.
Like
I mean, we did a wild rice whiskey that was brown rice was the grain that we used, and it was super cool, but it was not like economically viable in any way. It was a super expensive thing to work with, and nobody's going to pay $100 for like this size bottle of 2-year-old whiskey. So maybe now they would, I don't know, but that was a really cool project that we did.
Question 3. Sure.
Yeah. Well, let me prepare you for the whiskey first.
Yep. What are we drinking?
This one will be what did I send to you actually?
Let's see. I have the bottled and bond straight bourbon.
Yeah.
The chocolate whiskey,
okay.
And then your corn moot whiskey.
The which one? What?
The corn.
Oh, good. That's well. We should have started with that. I didn't realize that's what I had sent you. So let me grab.
Is that the one we're doing next? Then is the corn one.
Well, yes. Let's do it next.
All right. So What can you tell us about our corn whiskey?
So, corn whiskey is my favorite class of whiskeys. It's a designation that exists. Most countries around the world, whiskey has to age for 3 years or at least 2 years. In the United States, we have this one carve out that corn whiskey can be unaged. And unaged whiskey is frowned on by the sort of geekdom of whiskey. But you know, the older whiskey is, the better it is, right? I mean, obviously, if you have a 4-year-old whiskey is twice as good as a 2-year-old whiskey, and an 8-year is twice as good as the 4, and a 0-year-old whiskey is just, you know, it's 0% good. If you do whiskey connoisseurship by arithmetic,
yeah,
which is how most people approach it. But I mean, obviously, because I grew up in Kentucky and I grew up, and I like the idea of moonshine, and to recognize that it is just a cultural thing. Like tequila, people, you know, there's people who prefer silver tequila to aged tequila. It's just what do you like to drink? It's not about what is better. It's not about what's more expensive. And so the same is true with different types of rum, and in terms of brandies, you have eau de vies and you have grappa, and then you have the aged version. Only in the world of whiskey have people gotten so sort of pretentious and culturally sort of programmed to disavow the unaged whiskey completely. But I find that an eau de vie of corn, if you think of it that way, can be really fantastic. And so this is our entry into that. It's actually been a minute since I got to drink the moonshine, and I'm just like, oh man, I love this stuff.
Oh no, I agree with you. I think people, like, we get so hung up on a number, and people think that just the older is the better, and that makes it more expensive and whatever.
So yeah, cheers on this. This is
cheers.
It's very hard to pull off, you know. I mean, I think if you, well, obviously, let's remove age from the equation. There's all these other factors that make a huge difference in how the whiskey is: the ingredients, the process, the fermentation, all of which yield, for the unaged spirit, you know, you're going to have a wide variety of grades of an unaged whiskey. So, you know, we've always sort of aimed at the more smoother, more approachable, distill that as narrowly as possible for quality. And then the assumption is that everything else that comes from this will be good. And we don't do anything different for the moonshine necessarily than we do for the aged whiskeys. But it is the building block from which all of the aged whiskeys come. And so it's really the foundation of Kings County as a distillery, both sort of culturally and sort of historically, but then also in practical fact, this is just really the base of which all of our whiskeys are made. And I'm sure when we have 7-year-old and 10 and 12-year-old and 18-year-old, we're going to say, you know, this is the finest whiskey that we make. But you know, it's interesting. We did come out with a 7-year this past year.
That's what I was going to say. You guys just released, like, it was back in September. You had a 7-year-old release.
Yeah, and I will concede my preference would have been for our 4-year bottle and bond, which is probably the next whiskey that we should try. But but you know, it's like it's not actually a question of excellence or not. It's taste is so subjective, and what one person likes, another person inevitably is not going to like. So, you know, I find the obsession with perfection in the world of whiskey to be a great distraction from the pleasure of enjoying whiskey.
Yeah,
to some degree.
And I think too, I think one of the things that makes you guys so enjoyable is, like you said, you don't come from the distillery background. You came as a hobbyist, so you're
right.
There are no rules for you. You're just kind of like, okay, let's do something else, and like just see if it works.
Well, and I'm a person who was a consumer first. You know, I was a person who wondered if, does a single barrel make a difference? Does the water make a difference? Does age make a difference? You know, these are real questions that we all have. And so through the distillery, I've made it sort of a goal to answer those questions for myself. And some of those questions may not get answered for 18 years, but a lot of them you can figure out right away. And water, for instance, is one of those things that probably doesn't make a huge difference, but just a big part of the storytelling for a lot of places. But it's an easy thing to tell a story around because it's abstract and who could ever call your bluff. But again, there's sort of the sensory aspect of whiskey tasting, or there's the data of whiskey tasting. Where does the water come from? What's the character of the water? And then there's the sensory aspect. And again, if you can't tell the difference, and many experts cannot tell the difference between, something that's from one type of water source and another type of water source. And that doesn't mean that you are failing somehow. It just means that particular variable doesn't make a huge impact on the final spirit. So I think that piece of it, you have to approach the experience of whiskey both ways, both know everything that you can know and throw that completely away, and then just taste the whiskey blindly and with a completely open mind, and embrace the truth of what you come out of that with. If you genuinely prefer the younger thing, then that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it wrong. That means maybe the older is not better, or the older was flawed in some way that they decided to release it anyway because they knew that the marketing would sell it. The sort of age alone would sell it. So, I think to really get under the hood, you have to be both sort of playing out all those variables and then sensory testing each one to see if it makes a difference.
Well, I think this leads then perfectly into our question 3, which is, what's easier, running a Moonshine distillery out of your apartment, or actually running Kings County out of the Navy Yard in Brooklyn?
That is a good question. Both are fraught with peril. I guess I would say there is something sort of pure about doing everything at a non-commercial scale. And so in a way, you can kind of, you could make perfect whiskey that way. When you're in your apartment and you answer to no one, perfect unaged whiskey, which many would argue is imperfect whiskey, or may not even be whiskey at all. But I think when you scale up and you do have sort of commercial imperatives, even if you don't necessarily put those front and center, but they're there. Not that you make compromises, but you make decisions in different ways. And distilling can be very, it's a lot of watching the kettle boil, so to speak. Yeah. So there would be nights where, I knew the distillation was not going to finish up till like 2 a.m. And I was just like dying to go to bed, but I had to stay up to shut the sink off and finish it up. So, not having to necessarily watch every batch is nice to be able to kind of deputize others to do that, and also to kind of appreciate what other people bring to it. So I guess I would say ultimately it's harder to do it all by yourself in an apartment, and it's fun mostly when in fact there's a lot of labor that goes into the fun of it. Yeah.
Sure. And then you can just shake your head yes or no, because I don't want to get you in trouble. But do you by any chance have a small still in your house, either in California or New York?
No, I can cleanly say that I do not. There is a place. I mean, we do have some stills that are appropriate for home distilling that we keep in the Navy Yard, and from time to time, distillers have come and said, "Can I borrow that to kind of learn it on my own?" And I've always let people do that because I think it makes somebody a better distiller to kind of do it really in that sort of smaller format. So it has always, there's always that part of me that wants to go back to having it be that sort of pristine thing. But then I always think about I do have to go to bed, and it's just it sounds more fun than I bet it will actually be. Interestingly, at the distillery in the Navy Yard, we do have like a lab-sized distillery, and we put that in, and it was really some of the older equipment that we had, we just kept over. And I kept thinking, well, I'm going to work out of there and just kind of constantly be tinkering. And, it's not to say I haven't done it, and I have played around with that sort of smaller scale system as a test kitchen, so to speak. But I don't use it nearly as much as I thought I would. And in fact, most experiments are carried out on the biggest, the big stills, because that's where it's the most practical to do that. So, yeah.
And then do your stills have names? Did you name your stills? I'm always curious as to.
We've worked with how many different stills now? I guess it's 13 different stills in total that have been legally demised stills of Kings County. Not all of them are named. We have two that are from Scotland. At a certain point, were named. Dumbo was the big one, and Maeve was the little one. A nice Scottish name there. But now we have a new still that never really got a name, and I don't know. So it's open if you have ideas.
There we go. We can start a contest to name the still. So
right. I mean, Dumbo was supposed to be the big one, so now we have a bigger one than Dumbo. So I don't know what we call that one. So before we do, question 4 should be paired with the bottled and bond. This is the one I have. So just a fun story of bottled and bond. So bottled and bond. It's kind of the highest class of any whiskey made anywhere in the world. It has to be single malt Scotch, has to be 3 years from a single distillery. This has to be 4 years from a single distillery, a single distiller person who makes it, and from a single season. So it marries both the single of single malt, which is a single distillery, to the sort of single vintage that you have in winemaking. And you have this highly constrained thing. So it's all the same age profile of the barrels that go into it. It has to be at least 4 years old. It has to be exactly 100 proof. So if you ever compare bottled and bonds sort of one to another, they will always be the same proof level, so that it's a sort of apples to apples thing. And it's really a craft certification that the federal government handed down, 124 years ago. So it's a way, it's not a craft certification in that it requires the transparency to say, this is the distillery that it was made at, this is the distiller who made it, and this is the year that this was, the season that this was distilled. So we put the season on the bottle. The one I have here is from fall 2000. I think that says 15. I don't know which one you have.
Fall 2015.
Oh yeah, okay. So we're drinking the same thing.
Okay. Bottled and bond, straight bourbon whiskey, volume.
On the back.
On the back. Oh yeah, batch 8. Yep, there we go. Yeah. Jesus. Like pulling teeth. I apologize.
It's a hazard of the fourth drink.
But the nose on it. Well, one, the color is just fucking stunning, but two, the nose is just amazing.
So this is really the best barrels that have passed the 4-year mark and are pulled from a set. So the season is January to June, or July to December. Those are the 2 seasons demised by the federal government. And so you will always be pulling barrels from either the first half of the year or the second half of the year. Fall 2015, that was pre-election. This has seen a couple different presidents.
Yeah.
But for us, what the flavor profile you get is that sort of chocolate, molasses, really sort of rich, deep bourbon, pot still notes. I mean, one big differentiation from Kings County that we haven't really talked about is that we use all pot stills and not column stills, which give you a lot more of a oily characteristic to the whiskey, a little bit more viscosity, more mouthfeel.
More Irish.
Yeah.
Which is why I think too, I love you guys so much, because as you can see,
I can disclose that we are in the process of selecting the first of our sort of Irish style whiskey barrels. So last year we did a pochine, which is kind of like an Irish moonshine, and then we put some of that into barrels to age. So we have a 1-year-old Irish triple distilled all barley whiskey that we're gonna pull just as a distillery exclusive next month for some reason, and that'll be kind of a thing going forward. Is that each year we do an Irish style whiskey, because now we have 3 stills we can triple distill.
Very nice. Well,
yeah, that's a fun thing.
Let me know if you ever need a taste tester. I mean, I'm right down the street, so like I can be there in a matter of minutes. I mean, mask on, I'll bring a straw, I'll be fine. Like
right. But this bottle and bond, so this is bourbon. This is same mash bill 80/20 as the flagship bourbon, but this is older and
wonderful.
This one is maybe my favorite. Yeah.
I mean, they're all really good, but this is nice. I don't know if you've seen the weather that we're having here in New York. It's It's cold, it's wet, and like this is just a perfect Wednesday night drink. It just warms your innards, and it's just it's so good. Like this is just really, really good. Well, then on to question 4 then. You guys have such an iconic bottle. What made you choose this style of bottle?
Well, this is one of the early moonshine bottles that I was doing. So at the architecture firm that I was working for, they had this kind of like neon sticky paper, and I would sneak some of that out of the office, trying to say, and take it home and type up the labels, cut it into strips, and that was going to be the thing. It was going to be mason jars and neon strips. And my business partner David kind of looked at it and said, what if could we find something more, a little less hokey, a little less on the nose. And so we found these great flask bottles. So these were kind of like, I don't know, barbecue sauce bottles or something like that. And it was kind of like, oh, let's do flasks. I don't know. Hudson was doing some smaller formats at the time, but nobody was really playing around with, and I was just kind of, selling it out of my apartment. So I was kind of like, it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be a legal bottle. It just needs to be the right amount for running around town.
Yeah. And again, I mean, like this, and then going to the Empire whiskey that you guys released. I mean, that was a bigger, squarer bottle, but still very iconic to your guys. And it just like this, I mean, it's so iconic, and it's just so simple, and it's beautiful, and just like understated, but it just pops, like immediately, like you scan the shelf
when you see it all
all
together, then you get the like rainbow of the grapefruit jalapeno, the strawberry ginger, the chocolate whiskey. It does kind of it helps to reinforce this idea, of which I hope the distillery continues to sort of be, which is just, we take the world of whiskey and we try to explore every corner of it, and we try to make products that appeal to every single type of person. And not everybody's going to like every whiskey, but surely we can make a whiskey that every person can find one that they appreciate. And so this has become that, and we've just kind of like stuck to it pretty religiously in a way that I think has helped us a lot, distinguish us from other companies that would come out with a much more developed bottle, but might have been, like as DIY sort of seat of the pants as we were. And I think it's created a little bit. I mean, it was helpful in the early days of the business to kind of say, hey, we're just kind of, we are winging it. And and we don't pay a graphic designer because that's not the kind of company that we are, and we still never have really, as far as I mean, so you know, it helps things in a lot of ways, because it just, you don't have to go get the graphic designer to design a new product. You just type a different phrase and scan it and send it to the label company. So
there you go. Well, if you ever need a designer, you just let me know. I work for whiskey, so you just keep.
Well, it's becoming, you know, more of a thing that we might need as we're growing, and I think the business.
I mean, again, it's just it is. I mean, I've used empties to carry around, like I in my breast pocket of my coat. I've used it across the board. So that
was the idea. It's like, ultimately it's something, it's meant to be not necessarily stashed up on the shelf forever, but just take it and drink it, you know. I mean, it's
now we're down to our last and final drink of the night. So which one are we drinking? The chocolate?
I'm down to my last. The dregs of my open chocolate.
So just you kind of glossed over it a little bit, but you said there was a jalapeno one back there?
There's a grapefruit jalapeno. Yes.
That's amazing.
Which is kind of a summer offering. And, you know, people don't drink as much whiskey in the summer. And so to be able to have like a summer whiskey, some people don't drink as much whiskey in the summer.
People are sick in the head.
Well, you know, it's actually a little tricky, because sometimes our sales in July and August are pretty, you know, thin, as people are drinking rosé.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to kind of come out with a summer themed whiskey, and that's what we've been doing for a couple of years now, is to have the grapefruit jalapeno, which is really kind of a cool flavor profile. Something about the grapefruit and the corn whiskey. I mean, Moonshine is a pretty intense flavor of its own. So, and there's kind of a Kentucky or Appalachian tradition of putting grapes or peaches or, you know, sort of fruit in Moonshine to kind of tamp it down. And so this is exactly that thing. But it's also, you know, flavored vodka is going to exist. Flavored whiskeys are going to be out there. Let's do something that's made with real fruit and is a little more sophisticated. And so this is our chocolate whiskey. This is it's Moonshine. So this is an unaged whiskey that's then infused with the husk of the chocolate. So just for the past year, we've been using Raka, which is another chocolatier. One distinction is that they don't roast their husks. So so there's maybe a little bit of a different flavor profile in recent editions of the chocolate, but it's still a bold, flavor forward whiskey. And this one, I would say, can be a dessert whiskey, or it can be because it's so bitter, like dark chocolate, it's a great cocktail ingredient.
Oh, absolutely.
So, yeah.
There's almost, and again, maybe even feel like this, like you said, like summer whiskey, but I kind of, now drinking this, I kind of want some guacamole. Like, I don't know, like there's something about the corn and the chocolate, and
actually, one of the best cocktails that I ever had with the chocolate whiskey was made in Houston. It was like a sort of like Mexican hot chocolate sort of kind of thing. That was really good. I mean, it just had a little kick, a little spice to it that really was a perfect pairing.
Yeah.
And so it lends itself to play with and kind of experimentation, for sure.
Like this, I could see this be like almost in like a really hotty, but like hot as in temperature and in spice. If you had like a spicy honey to it.
Right. It kind of wants a little sweetness added, because it isn't that sweet on its own. But it is, it's a cool, weird thing. And it makes you kind of appreciate chocolate in a different way, because the husks are the kind of woody, fibrous part of the chocolate. They're the inedible part of the chocolate. And therefore, they have more in common with the barrel, which does sort of an infusion with the whiskey. The sort of sap of the oak tree, the kind of charcoal kind of polishes the whiskey. The same thing happens with the chocolate husks, which is to say that there are flavors that are alcohol soluble that come out, but there are flavors that are not necessarily water or fat soluble that you would use to cook with. So alcohol can get an interesting, it can kind of salvage some flavor that would otherwise get, dumped out with the compost. So this has always been a cool one to kind of have. It's not a traditional whiskey, but it's fun.
But I have to blend that with the bond and just kick it a little stronger, and then I'll be a good for the rest of the night. So that'll be good. Fifth and final question: flip of the coin, yes or no. The coin will tell us the answer. Oops, sorry, I could drop it. You gonna write any more books?
Well, let's see what the coin says.
I got another fuck yeah. So
yeah. Well, funny you should ask. I had contemplated working on another book for a while, and well, I mean, I have a baby, an infant that sucked up a fair amount of the free time that one might use to do that. But just in the last month, I've been able to kind of get back into the next book in sequence. So the first book was a little bit of a how to make your own whiskey. That was the guide to urban moonshining, which is here. And then after that, I wrote Dead Distillers, which is really just a history book. Not nearly as popular as the How to Make Your Own Whiskey book. But I think the next book is going to be sort of a travelogue of visiting distilleries around the country, which I have done a lot of the research for already, to kind of identify things that I think are really cool as a distiller. I mean, not necessarily as a. I'm assuming that what gets me excited is maybe a little bit different than what the average person is. Would be excited by. So kind of looking at the whiskeys, but also the factories and the particularities of all that stuff, and then and the people themselves. I mean, that's also a really important factor. It's just who's running the thing and what do they care about?
Yeah.
And how much power and how much influence over the product do they really have? I think that's all very fascinating questions that are important to ask. And
well, those are our 5 drinks. Those are our 5 questions. I want to thank you so much, Colin, for your time. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, when you're back in New York and this fucking COVID thing is over with, we can actually share a few more of these in person. Really want to try the grapefruit jalapeno. So that sounds amazing. And again, many of those bottles behind you just look amazing. So again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And be safe. And hopefully we can drink together soon. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. I'm gonna pour another one so I can cheers you on the way out here.
I'll do one.
I'm going back to the straight bourbon because that's just a classic and may even benefit from a little chocolate residue in the glass. Amazing. Tim, thank you for having me. I'll see you again very soon. I hope to taste you on a lot of things when you come by in person. So
yes, I can't wait. So cheers.
Cool.
Be safe.
Cheers. Thank you.
We'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
That's good.